A day after India's first quarter GDP data was put out, credit rating agencies, including Moody's, has sharply cut GDP outlook for this year to 7.7%. It said that rising interest rates, uneven monsoon, and slowing global growth will affect the economic growth on a sequential basis. India grew at 13.5% in the first quarter, that is April to June, and this double-digit number is the largest or the fastest India has grown in a year. But it is being looked at from the context of a lower base effect, which has led to that double-digit number and is marginally less than expectation. So is it a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of a situation? To get more perspective on the GDP numbers, also where the economy is headed, I'm joined today exclusively by K.V Subramanian. He is a former Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India and ED Elect at the IMF. He will soon be taking on that position as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Subramanian, for speaking with us here at ET Now. Let me just begin by getting your perspective on that 13.5% growth figure for Q1 and all of the commentary that has come in since, where on the one side, people are pointing out that the 13.5% or the double-digit number is because of a base effect and is lower than what the RBI itself had forecast at about 16%.
Thank you very much, Tamanna, and a very good evening to viewers. So let me make two key points on this GDP growth number. Firstly, to take into account the argument that this is driven by base effects, let's look at the growth rate over a 3-year horizon. And let's do that in a cross-country perspective, because the entire globe has actually suffered from first the COVID crisis and then Ukraine. And therefore, I think a comparative perspective is extremely important. If we look at a 3-year horizon, in other words, we basically look at the GDP for this quarter in the April to June of 2022 vis-a-vis April to June of 2019, then, among the top 10 economies for which we have the data currently, India is by far the highest at 3.83% growth over a 3-year horizon. Let's take the United States. United States has had a growth of 3.78%, marginally lower than that of India. But keep that together with the fact that the United States is now having unprecedented inflation. 9.1% was the inflation print in the month of July, and they're expecting a print of 8.5%. Even at 8%, their inflation was 400% higher than average. In contrast, India's inflation now is trending sharply downwards. So we are actually, having a 3-year growth rate that is higher, despite the fact that the United States printed money like, there is no tomorrow, and that is being seen in inflation. Now, let's also look at other countries. And I'm going to, mention these countries in descending order of their growth rates. If you look at Canada, 2.6% over a 3-year horizon, UK 1.06%, France 0.7%, Italy 0.2%, Germany 0.1%, and Japan minus 1.3%. These are the top 10 economies. Compared to these, India clearly at 3.8% with a much lower inflation, I think stands out very, very well. That's point number one. Let's look at the second point, which is actually analyze the components of the GDP. We know very well that GDP is comprised of consumption, investment, and exports and imports, of course, government expenditure as well. Now, here, what is really important to look at is the parts of GDP that are really reflective of the strength of the economy, and that is consumption, investment, and exports. Imports, if you keep in mind, actually that is demand that is being catered to by other countries, and government spending that's a choice variable. So if we look at the components, you can see that consumption has grown at 26% year on year. The investment has grown at 20.1% year on year, and exports have grown at 14% 13.7% year on year. Let's look at these, even from a 3-year perspective. If you look at it from a 3-year perspective, consumption has grown at 9.1% over a 3-year horizon, investment at 5.5%, and exports at 19.6%. So, exports are up almost 20% compared to the pre-COVID numbers. If you look at the combination of these three, which is consumption plus investment plus plus exports, compared to last three years back, we are at 9% higher. And just compared to last year, we are at 22% higher. I think the part of the lower number is because imports have grown at almost 38%. And government spending has actually grown at only 1.3%. And to me, that is an aspect that I think the government absolutely needs to focus on. Government spending growing only 1.3% year on year. So if you look at these, this is the second point, the aspects of the economy that are actually reflective of the strength of the economy, consumption, investment, and exports, they've clearly grown very well, even over a 3-year period, and certainly on a year-on-year basis. And let me just conclude this part of the comment by saying that if, for instance, imports had grown just at the rate of exports, and if government spending had grown at the rate of the other items, the actual growth would have been 20% and not 13.5%. So that, I think, is reflective of the strength of the economy. Even on a cross-country basis and fundamentally itself, I think this is a very good growth print, and I think we should stop doing this practice of always focusing on the glass half empty.
Okay, why then do you think that a slew of agencies, and I talked about Moody's in my introduction, but Citi as well, have downgraded the annual forecast? And I'm not getting into the semantics of glass empty or glass full, but one of the concerns they've mentioned is the impact increasing interest rates are going to have on demand and on consumption going forward. Do you share those concerns, and why do you think then that they have downgraded the annual number?
So I cannot speak for the others, but I always like looking at this, examining it very rigorously. If you look at the components that I've just mentioned, clearly consumption, investment, and exports are indeed reflective of the the strength of the economy. And in my opinion, many of these assessments are actually overblown on the negative side. I'll tell you why. Because if you take the impact of interest rates, and I've mentioned this before as well, if you look at the impact of that on demand, oftentimes commentary does not make a difference between the impact on consumption demand and the impact on investment demand. When you look at impact on consumption demand, it is only consumer durables and real estate or personal housing. These are the only two items of consumption that change based on on interest rates. Because in India, for instance, people do not borrow to eat. People do not borrow to go on a vacation. People borrow only maybe to buy a two-wheeler, maybe a car, maybe a refrigerator, maybe a fridge, or maybe a house. These are the only aspects of consumption that are impacted by interest rates. And if you look at the proportion of consumption that is accounted by these durables and and housing, it's a very, very insignificant proportion. In my opinion, I think this kind of granular analysis, looking at what aspect of consumption is indeed going to be impacted by interest rates, is missing in a lot of the commentary. And that is why there you find a lot of wishy-washy comments actually on this. When you look at the the other aspect, which is investment, investment definitely does get impacted by interest rates. Because not only is it the case that investment actually is done by borrowing, it is also the case that a lot of promoters, pledge their equity in order to take on debt. Therefore, there is clearly impact of interest rates on investment. So I think, and that impact on investment is usually lagged. So, I mean, I do have a concern that the raising of interest rates, may actually have an impact on investment going forward. But I think the impact on consumption is clearly overblown, and these are wishy-washy commentaries.
You talked about how India has grown in the last 3 years compared to other nations in the world. And I think it's important that we take this 3-year period as the base, because there has been so much of ups and downs, and then you have this base effect sort of distorting where we are. So we've grown about 3 to 4%, between 3 to 4%, I think fair to say, in the last 3 years. The question very simply is, could we have done better? Is this the best an economy like India could have done?
So I think that question has to definitely be answered in the context of the global shocks that not only the Indian economy but the rest of the world has witnessed. I think it would be very hypothetical and just a flight of imagination to actually answer this question without taking into account the context in which these growth numbers are being spoken about. And that is why I actually always do a cross-country examination, because if you don't do a cross-country examination, the number in absolute does not take into account the impact of these shocks. If you look at the fact that we have grown among the top 10 economies, by far the greatest, with a fiscal policy that was we spent less in a much more targeted manner. We did supply side measures, and keep in mind that we had the most stringent lockdown in the first quarter of FY21, and that was important. And actually, we've shown it very, very rigorously in the economic survey that actually led to enormous number of lives being saved. Do remember that the first wave, there wasn't enough known about how to handle the pandemic. It was even the case that doctors didn't know whether to use ventilators or not. For a country of India's population and India's population density, the number of deaths that would have happened but for that is actually very large, and that has been already shown in the economic survey. The significant decline in the first quarter of FY21 happened because of the lockdown, and therefore we are actually seeing this 3.83% is of course the impact of that lockdown. If you look at even the last year's, the second wave also had an impact on the economy, because it's a very simple thing. When you have lockdowns, there is basically economic activity that is being restricted, and therefore there will be an impact on GDP. But that is not reflective of the structural strengths of the economy. And this is where a lot of commentaries, I think, make the mistake that a lockdown is basically an enforced restriction on economic activity, not reflective of the structural strengths of the economy. So I think in the context of the fact that we basically have not spent the way other countries have spent, and therefore we do not have the kind of inflation problem, like unprecedented inflation problem that other countries are facing, and the fact that we had to do the lockdown in the first wave, given the unique conditions that India has, I think this is still very, very, very good growth.
Let's talk broadly now going forward. What are the strengths and challenges that India faces? You've spoken about how there has been a robust recovery in consumption, very consumption-driven economy, so that's definitely a strength. But in terms of challenges, would you say keeping inflation in check is one big red flag, along with the inequality of growth that we have been seeing, that K-shaped recovery that everyone's been talking about since pandemic? Has that worsened?
So first of all, let me be very clear. This, term K-shaped recovery is a disingenuous term. Why? Because, in any year, normal year or crisis year, there is always differences in the growth rate that happens across sectors, across different industries, across the nature of firms. For instance, if you take the time of the global financial crisis, you did not have the service sector impacted as much. Manufacturing was impacted significantly more. People didn't call that basically a V-shaped or a K-shaped or any other term. So why do that? Now V-shaped, actually, the term was coined for basically looking at the GDP growth itself. The K-shape is about opening the black box. And as I said, earlier as well, in any year, like the 5 fingers on the hand, there is always differences across sectors. That I don't think is actually, reflective of the recovery at any point in time. I think that is the key point, remember. Now, in terms of the challenges that you spoke about, I actually do not think that inflation, is as big of a problem for us as it is for the rest of the world. I would actually, mention that the that increase in the in government spending, especially on infrastructure. I think I would actually put that out as the key area that the government needs to focus on, because as I said, I've seen that the government spending this quarter actually year on year has only increased by 1.3%. And I think we do not want a situation where the budgeted capital expenditure, the budgeted infrastructure spending does not happen. I think it is extremely critical that the budgeted spending, especially in infrastructure and capital expenditure, because that has a multiplier effect. I've written about this in the economic survey, and it also crowds in private investment, and therefore, the capacities of ministries to be able to actually implement the budgeted spending is extremely important. I think they need to ramp up. That is the key challenge that I would mention. At the same time, also following up on some of the reforms that were actually done. I think that is equally important. For instance, the labor reforms that were done. I think it's been 2 years now, and I think now it's high time that the rules for that actually are implemented. I think the legislation has already been passed. So, in Hindi we say, for instance, that hati nikal gayi hai. So, the pooch is left, or basically the elephant is gone, the tail is remaining. That I think is important. So these and the other privatization as well, that needs to be accelerated too. I think these are important aspects. I do not really think that inflation will be as big of a concern for us as it is for us to push on infrastructure spending, and also continue pushing on the structural reforms.
I want to get your view on another area which has been dominating headlines, and I would say it's an economic and a political question, even a legal one now since the Supreme Court has seized off it. And it is the big question over freebies. How do you define freebies? Can freebies be, or government welfare schemes be pegged as good or bad depending on who's putting them out? What are the sections which need this aid and which are the ones that don't? Would you want to weigh in on this debate?
Absolutely. I think in my mind, I'm absolutely clear about how we should be, defining, freebies. If you would recall in the economic survey, the chapter on countercyclical fiscal policy, I had actually mentioned that if you look at revenue expenditures, the multiplier that you get for the economy, the sovereign spends, let's say 1 rupee, the economy only adds between 92 to 93 paise. So about 8 paisa gets actually lost. In contrast, if you take capital expenditures, if 1 rupee is spent by the government, by the sovereign, overall, during the time of that capital expenditure, between 4.5 to 5 rupees is added to the economy. So I think the way to segregate, what is a freebie versus what is not, is very simple in my opinion. Revenue expenditure, and I think a large part of that, I would say, would be part of basically, the component that belongs in freebies, and that needs to actually be really reduced. While capital expenditures, and here I'm including things like capital expenditures on human capital, whether it is healthcare, education, etc. I think these are also very important aspects of creating human capital, and therefore I would include that as part of capital expenditure, because these have very beneficial effects. So things like, for instance, if you take the farm loan waiver, the government, the previous government in 2008-9 had done a huge farm loan waiver. That is clearly a freebie. It's a revenue expenditure, or for that matter, not charging for power. And I think therefore it creates a lot of distortions. These are the kind of expenditures that will clearly belong in the revenue expenditure segment and therefore constitute freebies. So to me, the separation is basically revenue expenditure versus capital expenditure including health spending on healthcare, education, those that lead to human capital. So that's the way I would basically say that going forward, when we look at the FRBM Act, we should be looking at segregating and saying that there must be limits on revenue expenditure and capital expenditure should be encouraged. So I think that is the easiest and the simplest way, in my opinion, to actually really make policy actionable, so that freebies are not indulged in by governments.
But can a court of law or can a central government decide what state governments do in a federal structure? That's where it gets tricky, isn't it? Who decides?
So, I think to me, it's very clear that the courts have absolutely no jurisdiction in this. This is clearly matters of policy. Courts, their mandate is to interpret law, and in situations where there is basically if there is a law that is violated, to ensure that rule of law prevails. They have absolutely no locus standi in talking about about policy matters. That is very, very clear. It's crystal clear. Now, when it comes to actually the central versus state, I think what is important is that when it happens through revenue spending and revenue or overall spending itself and the borrowings being done by states, overall borrowing and the way that impacts the macro stability is a macro issue at the country level, and that is something which actually the central government is absolutely responsible for. If, for instance, macro situation is good, the credit goes to the central government. But if the macro situation is not that good, the blame has to go to the central government. Therefore, given that these freebies do impact borrowings and whether or not that adds to GDP growth, I think it is very important from that perspective, because even our constitution clearly mentions that these are aspects that comes under the central government's purview. So I think given that this affects macro fundamentals, I would say central government absolutely has a role through the FRBM Act to actually ensure that spending happens far more on capital expenditure, including education and healthcare, so that not only is it the case that the multiplier is greater, but there is growth that is generated as well. So I think that again is very clear to me that these are aspects that the central government has to actually, in the interest of the nation, ensure that the right policies are followed.
Let me now broaden the scope of our conversation beyond the Indian economy. You are soon going to be taking up a role at the IMF, and many congratulations on that. Interestingly, just today, the IMF has signed off on a $2.9 billion loan to Sri Lanka. How do you look at that in terms of getting this island nation back on its feet and the suddenness with which the Sri Lankan economy seemed to have collapsed? Is there a warning sign there?
No, absolutely. I think when I read what has happened in Sri Lanka, some commentators, for instance, have said, "Oh, it is because of some genocide, that may have happened in earlier eras." I think there is absolutely no evidence to that, and we have to be very careful to make sure that we do not equate correlation to causality. I think the main reason why the Sri Lankan economy actually came under stress is because of COVID. Because do keep in mind that the two biggest contributors of foreign exchange into the Sri Lankan economy are tourism revenues from tourism, and remittances. And both of these were very, very significantly impacted, due to COVID, and that ensured that they're actually, normally what they would have been able to pay for imports through the foreign exchange revenues that come from tourism and through remittances, those dried up significantly, and that led to their foreign exchange reserves depleting significantly. In fact, when I've actually looked at some of the calculations, if, for instance, COVID had not happened, and therefore their tourism and remittances would have actually continued the way they did, they wouldn't have faced the crisis today that that they are facing. In fact, even some of the commentaries like it is because of organic farming, etc., those were not the key factors. Those are factors that may have been secondary, factors that may have added to the problem. But I think the COVID was the key shock. But there is still an important lesson. If, for instance, Sri Lanka had not done foreign exchange borrowings, because they came under stress because the remittances died up, tourism revenues died up, that reduced their foreign exchange. Apart from having to take care of imports, they also had to pay their foreign currency obligations. So the key lesson for emerging economies there is to be careful in terms of the foreign exchange borrowings that they do. I think that is the key lesson here, not that something that happened 2 decades back, or something
what about what's happening with Pakistan and Bangladesh? Can we see it in the context of Sri Lanka, or is it again all COVID related?
See, Pakistan, I think from an economy perspective is a basket case. I don't think there is much to learn there. So, I don't want to waste, readers' precious time in commenting on the Pakistani economy. If you look at, the number of times that they've gone to the IMF for bailout, they've just gone repeated. They've basically been repeated, serial sort of offenders on this. So I think that let's not waste our time with their economy. With Bangladesh, I think, from what I read, and, I must confess that I have not track the Bangladeshi economy as closely, as I've done the Sri Lankan economy. But it does seem, and I think some of the commentary is that some of the growth numbers, some of those may have been overblown. I think, and some commentators did get, very enamored by some of those growth numbers. I think now the reality is clearly setting in. But to me, it does seem that, the Bangladeshi economy is not in as difficult a shape as the Sri Lankan economy or the Pakistani economy. It is more a case of them basically trying to ensure that their foreign exchange reserves are adequate to be able to take care of any difficulties that might come. They have been impacted as well by COVID and the lack of reforms. If you see, for instance, Bangladesh, unlike India, after 2014, we basically deregulated the fuel prices. Bangladesh did not, and therefore the increase in the in crude oil prices created a very difficult situation, the kind of situation that prevailed in India pre-2014, which basically increased their fiscal deficit and their current account deficits, etc. So again, I think there's a lesson there for other emerging economies that some of these reforms, actually biting the bullet, I think is important in terms of regulating. You can't continue. That's an example of a freebie as well. And I think indulging in that freebie has actually brought Bangladesh into some trouble as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Mr. Subramanian, on the Times Network. Great to have you on the show, and best of luck for all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.